I'd like to introduce Jordan, who will introduce the panel. So Jordan, BBC journalist and one of the co-hosts of the podcast, The Climate Question. If you haven't listened to The Climate Question, I thoroughly recommend that you do. It's a great podcast series, part of the BBC World Service, and I use it for my students on my MBA and MSc Finance class to basically go through case studies of around the world, especially in developing countries, of how climate finance is being looked at on the ground. It's been really engaging to use it with students, and it's great to have Jordan here as one of the co-hosts moderating this session. So over to you, Jordan.
Just on this one? Yeah, like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. It's available where all good podcasts can be found. So I want to get a round of applause, first of all. I know it's the last session today, but if we could put our hands together, keep the energy going. So this is going to be a quick fire round. It's your chance to put questions to our leading researchers here, which we're going to get up on the Mentimeter. I'm going to start with one of mine. But first of all, I'll introduce our panelists. We've got Professor Joeri Rogelj, Climate Scientist and Policy at Imperial. Then we've got Dr. Vivien Foster, who's Principal Research Fellow at Imperial College, and Professor Ralf Toumi, Director of the Grantham Institute. So thanks very much. I'm going to start with one of my questions. So I'm just back from Georgia in the United States doing a US election road trip. And I was there looking at what climate finance has done practically in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act. I was at solar panel factories, EV factories, and lots of different places in the middle. And it was absolutely fascinating seeing what the money that we talk about can actually buy when it comes to mitigation. Guys, this is for all of you. A nice positive question. If you could click your fingers and do one thing with climate finance, what would that be? I'm going to start with you, Ralf.
I think one of the things about climate finance, I think we heard a little bit about the adaptation. I think it's not really one thing, but I think the key thing that's often missing is actually financial innovation. There are always different bits of information out there. How do you combine it, particularly for adaptation, to make it into a profitable exercise? So it'd be great, I mean, just putting it out there, if we had some massive hackathon, rather than every company individually out-competing their idea. I think if there was more entrepreneurship around business innovation in both adaptation and mitigation, I think that's the thing I would do. I'd really sponsor more activity in this area.
I made you magic, Ralf. We can make it happen. Just click the fingers.
Great, come here and do it.
Okay, what about you, Vivien?
Well, Jordan, my work is focused a lot on the global south, so I have a slightly different perspective on all of this. We've talked a lot today about project finance, but before you even get to the project, there's an enormous amount of upstream preparation work that's needed. And the reality is that in many low and middle income countries, those upstream stages are simply not there. The strategic aspects, the planning, the financing strategies, the policy environments. And as a result of that, there's really a massive scarcity, a chronic scarcity of bankable projects, even though there's huge investment needs and supposedly financiers are potentially willing to finance. And so I think we've been studying some of the more successful developing countries in terms of their ability to mobilize climate finance. And we've come up with a sort of adage, which is data to deal. Data to deal draws on experiences in Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, other Latin American countries. And the idea is that you need a sustained and structured process all the way along from the beginning of the data investment, the investment pipeline, all the way through to the deals. And so my ask, my wish would be for a major global capacity building and technical assistance effort to equip low and middle income countries to own and direct their own investment pipelines for the climate transition. And there's some evidence that the G20 is thinking along those lines.
Excellent. Okay, Joeri?
Yeah, I had a very similar hope, and that was to resolve all barriers to finance flows to deliver necessary low-carbon transformation in the developing world, where I think there's we have these massive barriers. But if Vivien already took this one, then I will take an even bigger wish, and that is that just all externalities, including large or far-tail climate risks, as well as societal benefits, are actually visible and taken into account in finance decisions.
Okay,
like this.
like that. Now we're going to start our quick fire rounds. We're going to try and keep these answers as tight as we can. So the first one, Ralf, I'm going to you and ask, how is science feeding into the climate finance process? What are the connections?
So, well, I mean, I think, first of all, scientific training, you know, we train STEM people. So I think quantitative thinking is important. So it's the scientific method. Can you repeat? Can you confirm rationally? So I think it's all about the scientific method apart from anything else. And of course, then there are scientific details like technologies or scientific understanding like climate science. But I think actually a scientific training, so rigorous, quantitative, I think those are really, really important skill sets because this is a constantly evolving field and it's so diverse. So I would say the scientific method, applying the scientific method to this and less politics, maybe.
And are we seeing that with experts in climate finance? Have they got that scientific training and method?
I think the problem is, of course, like I tried to allude to, the problem often is at the political end or the decision-making end, which is then not a scientific thing. But I think all we can do as scientists is do the best job that we can. And I think we have to do that in an honest and a highly technical way. But the bottleneck is then not in the science. The bottleneck then is, in fact, in the decision-making and the politics. But I think, you know, as scientists, that's what we need to do.
Vivien, looking forward to COP29, in terms of your work in the Global South, how much finance do you think is going to be pledged in Baku, and who do you think is finally going to contribute?
Well, I certainly don't have a crystal ball.
This is not the click the fingers.
I don't have a crystal ball on that, but I do think that I find that the whole global conversation about climate finance has been very fixated on the sort of the one headline number, the 100 billion or whatever might supersede it, and hopefully it might be something a little bit more scientific than the 100 billion. But for me, what really matters is the climate financing gaps at the country level. Can countries actually afford their climate transitions? And if we are fortunate enough to have a bigger pot, you know, who really deserves the money the most and how should we allocate it? And for me, that's, I think, the central question that I hope the conversations at COP29 will go beyond the sort of the headline number.
So is that making it easier for countries to access cheaper loans and so on?
Yes, but also figuring out who's bearing the biggest burden. You know, in which countries is the net zero investment plan most onerous relative to what they would have to have borne in the absence of climate change? And I think there's a huge variation. I mean, there are countries where clean energy is their best option already, countries with abundant hydro or geothermal resources. There are others where it's going to require a huge shift. And therefore, I think the allocation of climate finance needs to bear in mind those kind of historical patterns and those varying endowments.
Okay. Joeri, I've got one for you. This is about overshoot. And this is the financial imperative for growth fundamentally at odds with 1.5 degree mitigation adaptation goals? And if so, what can we do?
Great question. I don't think it's fundamentally at odds, but again, if the system that drives that growth doesn't see the implications, and both in the near term and in the long term, of its decisions and of its avenues of growth, then we do have a problem, because we are, and this is kind of a mantra of a different community, but we are in the Anthropocene, and that is kind of a buzzword to just say that we are now at the scale of an economy that our choices do affect the health of our planet. And if that planetary health is not taken into account, then growth is, cannot be supported.
Well, I'm going to blend in another question just to you on that. Does that mean that things like ESG and sort of green investing, can we put some form of growth with this climate finance? Can there be a form of investment that leads to climate finance and growth without damaging the planet?
That's what we
that's what we hope. And I clearly think in the transition, there is clearly a lot of space for this, because there are various sectors that still need to grow enormously, while others, well, they will stall and they will even disappear. And so, yes, there is a clear growth story there. We also need to remember that the climate story and all the finance that goes in there is not just trying to solve the climate problem, but ultimately is in this bigger agenda, Agenda 2030 of the SDGs, where we see all the other avenues of growth, not just growth in terms of green solutions, but growth in terms of access to health services, eradication of poverty, and so on. So yes, it goes hand in hand, and I don't think it's separate.
Ralf, short one for you.
Yep.
Most underrated climate solution.
Most underrated climate solution, walking.
Nice.
Great.
Vivien. Vivien, most overrated climate solution.
Thank you.
Pass.
Pass.
Joeri, any pet hates?
Yeah, one that is not a solution, and that's solar geoengineering.
Okay.
It isn't one, so.
It's a quick fire round, so we'll just move on from that one. There's a great climate question episode on that, though, which is 26 minutes long, delving into it. Okay. I've got another one, sorry, for you, Joeri, actually. What is the role of litigation in motivating the change necessary for reaching transition goals and adaptation requirements?
Today, it's increasingly important. Fundamentally, litigation doesn't need to play a role, but litigation or litigators often see it as making politicians, making society, or making governments walk the talk. They don't want governments to make promises beyond what they have already promised. They don't want governments to promise a more stringent climate target or make commitments they have not yet made. They just want governments to actually implement the actions that are aligned with limiting warming well below 2 degrees or 1.5, with an equitable transition and fair distribution of burdens around the globe. And so, unfortunately, because of the decades of insufficient action we have seen, and the cumulative nature of the problem, it will grow and grow.
And do you think that's the same for corporations as well as governments?
Indeed, but on different levels. Corporations, particularly when they're large, they play central roles in how our society behaves and the impact it has. While their main reason is to generate profit, it can't be at the detriment or cost of everything. And so particularly corporations that have lobbied against regulation might see themselves in an increasingly tight place.
Okay. Vivien, thinking about the Global South, what are some things that could really help unlock the finance that they need to get towards the energy transition?
Right. Well, I mean, I think there's many aspects to this, but I'd like to bring up something that we haven't talked about today, because we tend to talk a lot about the actual generation plants, the solar farms and so on. But actually a huge bottleneck is the transmission capacity and the grid. And we know that many renewable resources are in far-flung locations, away from population centers. And so, there's an adage which says no transition without transmission. Because if we don't invest enough in transmission infrastructure, we won't actually be able to leverage and draw in all those renewable energy resources. And transmission infrastructure is quite difficult to finance, often because in the Global South, it's in the hands of public utilities that are often, just virtually bankrupt or very weak creditworthiness. And also because actually it doesn't often qualify for climate finance, concessional climate finance, because grids can carry both clean and dirty electrons, and that creates a real conundrum for multilateral financing institutions. So we've been working recently with the Green Grids Initiative, which is a post-COP26 initiative, to try and see how we could actually improve the availability of finance for grids.
Just on COP, I've got a question here, Ralf.
Yeah.
What does the whole climate jamboree do when we run out of carbon budget for 1.5 degrees before 2030? What happens to business models built around this increasingly defunct target?
Business models around the target. I'm not sure I completely understand.
I guess that is for 1.5 degrees.
But what do they mean by business models of the target?
I think if we
I mean, the COP has a business model? Is that what they mean?
Yeah, I think that is. I
question?
think that is. I'm interested in what you see the future of COP.
Yes. Well, I think COP, easy to criticize. I can stand here for half an hour and criticize. But it does have a function. And if you want to get all countries to agree on something, you need to do that sort of pain. If you're looking for it to lead the way, you're looking at the wrong place. I think leading the way will be individuals. Some of our kids out there studying, they're going to lead the way. So the COP isn't going to lead the way. The COP is probably more of a common denominator, but it has to be done. I mean, it has to be written down. It has to be agreed. Apart from anything else, it stops things from going backwards, right? So some of the things we've achieved was getting very frustrated. It's not quick enough. It's not quick enough. But at least, right, it sort of does put a barrier, I believe, on slipping backwards. So I think it's not the most progressive organization out there, and it wasn't designed that way. It has a function.
Do you feel like, I've always seen it as that's the one time we get to mark the world's homework, and it's the only game in time where people can come around and see how people are doing on their different pledges and bids?
I think it's a bit more complicated. I think Joeri may be a better place to answer this. I'm not sure, that sounds like public shaming. I don't think that's really happening.
That's what the journalists try and do.
So I don't know if Joeri...
Yeah, I mean, in the process, they do it every 5 years during the global stocktake. I contribute to an annual publication called the Emissions Gap Report, where we try to do it on an annual basis. Last year the title of the report was Broken Record. So it was the 14th time that we published the report. Of course, the message was always the same. So yes, I think highlighting that gap and the need to do more is important, will remain important. Generating that momentum is important. Allowing for the conversations is important. But there is one aspect of the COPs that I think is often overlooked and which is essential, and that is a place where actually vulnerable countries and small countries have a voice, and they have, at least on the plenary floor, as much of a voice to be heard as others. And that is not the G20 does not replace such things. Corporate action does not replace such things. It's the one form where that is really held very high.
Got a very popular question here. Vivien, I'm going to go to you first, but anyone feel free to chip in. Lots of people asking, how do you invest your pension?
Not me personally.
Well, I'm guessing that could be overall and to do with climate finance.
Yeah. We're all in the same pension schemes.
Yeah, I think few of us influence it directly, right? Because of institutional pensions, at least in some professions. I think others may be in private pensions and have a little bit more of a choice. It comes down, I suppose, to whether, is there a trade-off? Is it that cleaner investing will offer you as higher return as not? And so are you actually making a personal sacrifice in some way that you should make, possibly, or probably? I think those are some of the questions that arise for me around that statement. But I think for many of us, it's about influencing, larger institutional, investors who manage our funds.
Yeah, divestment and so on for change, absolutely. Do either of you want to come in on that? No, obvious pensions, okay. The next most popular one is, could I give us to you, Ralf?
Yep.
What is your take on degrowth?
Degrowth. Well, you just talked about going to the US, right? So they're investing huge amounts in clean tech and have basically performing a huge amount of investment in climate, but they will not tell their people they were investing in climate. They will say it's energy security. When I say they, one particular party. So even though you might be doing the right thing, even in that environment, you can't even tell them that it's to do with climate change. You talk about lots of other things but not climate change. So why am I saying that? If you're going to really take people with you around an argument about degrowth, I think you are really, really, really going to struggle. And I think it's not really a positive message. I can see the arguments for it, but being in a world where, the Green Party is more or less collapsing in Germany, if you push this agenda and you don't carry people with it, you're clearly going to have a problem. So I think the real challenge for degrowth would be, can you really persuade the population, which in the end, will drive the politics, that is a viable way forward for them. But bearing in mind that most people, most of the time, do not care about climate change.
So is that about communication? Because degrowth and what that brings to mind for lots of people, can you still achieve something similar, with sustainability through different word semantics and communication?
Maybe, but people are, through, I guess, social conditioned for consumerism, right? So I think that's a huge education piece to persuade people that they can do without growth, without consumer goods, without the goodies that life potentially can offer if you have enough money. I mean, that whole logic is so inbred in our social fabric. I think it's a big challenge.
Tough one.
I just wanted to complement that, because if it's a difficult challenge in US and OECD countries, imagine what kind of challenge it is in the global south, where so many people are still living in poverty and lacking basic needs. And so I think there's a huge equity issue to degrowth, because I don't think, even if you could sell it politically in rich countries, which seems very, very implausible, you'd have that whole side of things to deal with. I think if you do a back of the envelope calculation, you get to, if we did one of our click the fingers moments, if we could redistribute, income perfectly across the world, we would be at about $1,000 per capita per month. And so that's with even with a completely implausible redistribution pattern, that's what we have available. So it's not as though the economy is somehow big enough to meet everybody's needs, and it's just about tinkering with it. We do have a growth agenda one way or the other, just as Joeri pointed to with the SDGs.
Joeri, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, 2 points to add here. I think degrowth is really hard to see how it will really catch on. And a related concept that might work is post-growth, where the economic growth is not the goal in itself, but actually the development, which is defined in very diverse ways, is. And whatever the economy does, you invest and you make policies to drive these other development factors rather than just maximize your GDP growth. The one point about degrowth as well, or kind of reducing GDP, is that the end of our trajectory is, or a key milestone in our transition is net zero emissions. That means that even if you decline, you need to transform your economy intensely, because otherwise that milestone would be reached with zero GDP. That's not where we're going. So how you can make such a large, important, extremely challenging transition in the developed or the developing world without having an economy that actually turns quite healthily is a big question that I have not seen answered yet.
There's a question that's come up that comes up quite often from our audience as well, and I'm going to put that to each of you, and that is, do we need to finance brown companies to help them transition to green? What's quite often asked on our program is, do we need big oil to get to the energy transition? They have the money and the expertise and so on. So do we need climate finance to help with brown companies go green?
I think you've picked an example where I'm not really sure that, given the amount of funding they already have through government subsidies and the dividends they're paying, I'm not sure when you say we, I'm not quite sure if that means, does that mean the taxpayer, or does that mean pension funds? Yeah.
Any climate finance go to companies who are still polluting to try and get them to stop?
Well, okay, I should probably say yes, but actually in my heart of hearts, I think no, because I would be more disruptive. I would think actually maybe some of these brown countries have had their time, and it is time for new companies to take their place. And that's obviously not politically sensible because they have a huge lobby group and votes. But if you take a step back from it and you take a pure capitalist approach, you would say you've had your time, and there are new kids on the block, and if they can make more money than you in the new economy, so they should. So that would be my heart.
Vivien?
So I'd like to focus on two special cases. I think one is the premature retirement of fossil fuel generating plants. And we heard about it earlier today with the example of the Singapore transition credits, actually, which was an interesting one. But this is the notion of if you've invested in a plant and you have to retire it early, does it not make sense? Wouldn't you need to be obliged to compensate investors for the unamortized capital or the profits that they would lose from the remaining life? I think probably under normal rule of law that would be considered, appropriate or necessary in order for those plants to be shut down. I mean, you could take a very hardline view and say they shouldn't have invested at all, or they should have seen this coming, and they should. But I think at least that's widely considered to be a component of the transition. I think it's reasonable. The other special case I wanted to highlight is fossil fuel dependent low and middle income countries. So these are countries like Nigeria or Algeria or whatever, whose economies are so heavily invested in fossil fuels that for them it's not just about cleaning up a sector, it's about finding a new economic livelihood. And those countries, I think, are a big sort of political obstacle to agreements going forward at the global level. And I think we need to find a special approach for those countries because I think the challenge that they face is very much deeper than others.
We saw climate financing going 2 COPs ago to South Africa,
yes,
I believe, to try and move away from coal.
That's
that
right.
will go to Eskom, I'm guessing, the national power provider.
Well, I think it's also about sort of transitioning away from coal mining and the just transition aspects of that. But I think that's a bit different because South Africa's economy is somewhat more diversified. But there's also been a JETP for Senegal, which is a country that has just made a huge gas discovery, which it would like to exploit. But the question is, is that appropriate? And if Senegal is to leave that gas in the ground, then clearly some kind of compensation would be warranted. So I think there are some cases where it is relevant to think about this.
Joeri.
Yeah, it's interesting that the cases you mentioned are not really companies, they're countries.
They're countries, true.
And I think at the level of countries, it's easier to make the case that who should be supported are people. People should be supported in leading good lives throughout this transition. And this can be by reschooling them, by providing ways for them to have jobs in other sectors. In that sense, I'm less concerned about the company if there's other companies that take over and provide the good lives or the desirable lives for the people and the citizens.
Okay, I've got another question here. Any of you can come in on this. And this is about what can AI do to support climate finance?
Everything?
Yeah.
That's quick fire.
What can't it do?
I mean, where's the limit? It's hard to see the limits, right? I mean, we know AI now. I don't know what it's going to look like in 10 years. Maybe it's a bubble and it's going no further. I don't know. It can go all the way from, just very trivial, if you like, statistical data analytics to actual decision making, right? Which replaces many of us. So, yeah.
Okay, well, I've got a final question about technology that I'll save. Do any of the panelists believe that carbon credits are really part of the solution, or are they part of the problem? 5 thumbs up. Carbon credits, Joeri?
Yeah, in the end, global emissions need to get to zero, and probably where we are now, we even need to get to net negative emissions because we end up in a place that is way above the temperature that we find comfortable or acceptable or livable. Carbon credits need to contribute to that solution. So that means carbon credits that are additional, verifiable, that actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere permanently. Yes, carbon credits that sell something that doesn't exist, that maybe can be reversed in 20 years, either through physical means or through a simple accounting trick? Yeah, obviously not. And then there is, of course, the challenge of what the availability of carbon credits does to incentives for actors with the financial means to actually reduce their own emissions. Many of the emissions that are currently being offset with carbon credits are actually not in the group of hard to abate. We have options to abate them today, and so these options should be taken and not be kind of shielded through carbon credits.
So more regulation, then they can be a solution.
And yes, and high quality in whatever way possible.
Vivien, question here. Can debt for adaptation swaps emerge for developing nations, offering debt relief in return for clear investments in climate resilience?
I mean, I think it's a very interesting idea and definitely worth exploring. I'm always struck by how in some of the world's poorest countries is the adaptation investment that is much, much more of an economic burden than the mitigation because there's very little to mitigate. So I think that we do need to find a solution to this because some of the estimates that you see for the climate investments needed in countries, say like Malawi, are just implausibly large proportions of GDP. So I think it's a really interesting idea to try and hook these two things together.
Is it popular within the international community? Is there worries about how it'll be regulated, corruption, etc.?
I mean, all of these things are challenging to implement. But I mean, I think it depends what kind of solution it is. Some solutions are more permanent than others, and so easier to, it's one thing to build, cedar fences. It's another thing to plant trees that could later be cut down or burnt down or whatever. So there's a lot, the devil's in the detail, as with all of these things. But I think it definitely has potential and warrants further exploration.
Do you think it'll come up at COP29? Are we not there yet?
I don't know.
Don't know. Okay, Mike, shall I wrap it up?
Yeah, please do.
One final question.
Final question.
This is for each of you. This is to try and leave on a more positive and blue sky note with each of you. So, Joeri, I'm going to start with you. What excites you when it comes to climate finance, be that technology, new methods or strategies? What's exciting you in the future?
We touched upon it earlier, but I'm quite excited to see how justice and courts are impacting both the actions or holding both sovereigns and corporates accountable for the harm that their actions are causing. And I'm very excited to see which repercussions this will have in credit ratings and other financial consequences for these actors.
Okay, so justice for the climate. Vivien.
So I think in the low and middle income countries, we've made a lot of progress in the last 5 to 10 years on the transition planning aspects. A lot of countries have quite technically rigorous plans, but very little thought has been given to the financeability of those plans. And I'm beginning to see that issue now coming to the top of the agenda, both with climate finance being the headline issue for COP29, but also evidence that ministries of finance are beginning to mobilize around climate and around taking a more proactive role. So for me, that shift from just technical energy planning to the finance side being engaged in the delivery of the plans is a very positive development.
Okay, money then. And Ralf?
Well, I guess I've come from a very dark place originally, so I've been following this climate issue for a long time. So I remember when I first came across it, people were happily writing papers which nobody read apart from me and some of my colleagues, which said, oh yeah, there'll be a warming of 8 degrees, 9 degrees, and nobody really at that point had any idea what that actually meant. So I'm really happy that I'm actually very confident that we're not going to explore this world of 6, 7, and 8 degrees. And part of that reason is because actually, in a way, talking to the Aussians here in the business school, the market sort of has worked. I mean, renewable energy is now competitive. You don't need to care about the climate. Maybe Elon Musk doesn't, but he can still be the richest man with his Tesla. So the market has sort of worked. I mean, it's not working fast enough, and it has been the cause of the problem, but it has worked, and we are avoiding some of the really catastrophic things which were certainly running around even 10, 20 years ago, I think.
So the future looks brighter.
Brighter.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Round of applause for all our panel.
Thank you very much, Jordan, for expertly moderating that and taking all those questions. Thank you, the audience, as well. I mean, I was moderating the questions. We had about 60 or 70 come in. So not all of them were answered, thankfully, because we would be here all night. And we've got drinks outside waiting. But before we go out for drinks, it's been a pleasure hosting this event today on behalf of the Centre for Climate Finance and Investment. And we just wanted to close out with a big thank you to everybody who has spoken, contributed, organised, filmed, recorded, and moderated all the panels. So I won't name them all because we'll be here for too long, but it's been a real big team effort. So thank you, everybody. And just finally, please do send your feedback to us at the CCFI about what you thought about today so that we can make next year's event even better.